A city can be perfectly designed for a world that disappears. That's the story here. 20 ancient cities, each one engineered for a climate that doesn't exist anymore. You'll see the blueprints they left behind, in stone, in earth, ingenious blueprints, sometimes haunting. We'll walk through desert cities that thrived on captured fog. We'll climb mountain citadels built as intricate water clocks. There was a society that flourished in the heart of a salt desert. There was a mighty river city that faded into silence. Each ruin holds a secret, a pact between human ambition and a specific, vanished environment. Their forgotten wisdom speaks to our moment, our precarious moment. When you look at a crumbling wall, what do you see? A monument to failure or a lesson in resilience? Mohenjo-Daro. Its streets were laid out in a grid, all baked brick. But the real intelligence of the place was underneath. This was a city from 4,000 years ago, built for a certain kind of world. A world with predictable rains, reliable floods from the Indus River. The whole design was a conversation with water. They built for the community, for that resource. You don't see a grand palace there. The most striking thing is the Great Bath. A large, sealed public pool, probably for ritual, for social life. Water had a deep meaning for them, but that was just the part you could see. Under the main streets, there were covered drains. Bricks fitted together precisely, and the homes had private bathrooms, their waste channels connected to that larger system. Public wells were spaced throughout, so everyone had clean water. This was more than just convenience. It was a public health achievement. It let the city reach a density that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. Archaeologists, people like Jonathan Mark Canoia, look at this infrastructure. They see a society that valued collective well-being, sophisticated planning. Their whole existence was tuned to a climate. It gave them seasonal abundance. The raised citadels, the sloped streets, all of it worked to channel floodwaters safely, to store water for the dry times. So then you have to ask, what happens when that rhythm stops? The city's gradual fading is tied to a changing environment. The monsoons became less reliable. The Indus River may have shifted its course. The very water patterns they had mastered began to drift away. This civilization invested so much in communal water, saw its management as a kind of duty, and their foundational pact with nature just dissolved. The ruins are silent, orderly. They leave you with a question. Where does modernity begin? With the wheel, with writing, or with the simple, revolutionary idea of a city that kept its water clean? That mastery of abundant water, it's a complete contrast to another ancient society, one that faced the opposite problem. They built a metropolis not for managing floods, but for pulling life from one of the driest places on earth. The desert asks for a different kind of genius. The Nabateans in the red canyons of southern Jordan, they built an empire, but not on fertile land. It was built on control. On the precise control of chaos. Their capital was Petra, a mirage made real. For a caravan coming through the sick, that narrow, winding gorge, it was all awe. Sunlight dappled the path, cliffs went up hundreds of feet. What those travelers couldn't see were the secrets inside the rock itself, hidden channels. Engineered slopes, all of it designed to capture a fleeting resource, a violent one, the occasional flash flood. In that hyper-arid landscape, water didn't come gently. It arrived in torrents, a sudden, destructive bounty. The Nabateans didn't see a threat, they saw their lifeblood. They engineered Petra to be a giant catchment system. A hydraulic machine disguised as a city. A scholar, Lee Ann Bedal, she calls it that, a hydraulic city. Their mastery was geological. They understood how water moved across stone. They carved massive underground cisterns, vast chambers hollowed from bedrock, storing thousands of gallons. They built diversion dams to steer floodwaters away from the city center into these reservoirs. Then, through a network of ceramic pipes and channels, they used gravity to send that water to every corner of Petra. It fed public fountains, it irrigated terraced gardens. It filled pools that reflected the rose-colored cliffs. Even the treasury, Al-Kosneh, that iconic facade, it was part of this. Channels were carved high above it in the cliff face. To manage runoff, to stop erosion from destroying the carvings below, this was the foundation of their wealth. Petra became a lush oasis, a powerful trade hub. Because it could offer what no other desert stop could, reliable water, their entire social structure, their economy, it was built on this engineered balance. They had tamed the desert's erratic rhythm, but that rhythm could change. Their brilliant system was vulnerable to seismic shifts that could crack their cisterns, crack their channels, and to a longer, deeper shift, a prolonged drought where those reservoirs could sit empty, season after season. Their prosperity was carved from the management of a single, fragile resource. And when that pact with a specific climate broke, the city's vibrant heart slowly stilled. It's a story of astonishing adaptation and a sobering lesson in dependency. This mastery over scarcity, it stands in sharp relief against the next city, which faced the monumental challenge of a world with far, far too much water. The jungle canopy hides a secret. Under the pyramids at Tikal, there's a city, but also a kind of machine, a living one built for a rhythm, the rhythm of that place. Intense wet seasons, then months of drought. The Maya didn't just build temples, they sculpted the earth, they sculpted the water. Their genius was turning a challenge into something else. Into abundance. The soil there, the rainforest soil, it's thin, poor for farming, and the seasonal floods, they could wash everything away, so they reimagined the landscape. They went into the swampy lowlands, the bojos, and they dug. They dug networks of canals, and with the earth they removed, they built up these long platforms. Rectangular platforms, these were raised fields. You had a grid of fertile islands surrounded by water channels. During the heavy rains, the canals would drain the excess water away, so the crops wouldn't drown. Then in the dry season, that same water would seep back, slowly, into the planting beds, irrigating them. It was a self-regulating system. But the water management, it went beyond the fields. The city itself was a catchment basin, the grand plastered plazas, the steep slopes of the pyramids. They weren't just for ceremony, they were designed to channel rainwater. Every downpour was captured, directed through stone channels into reservoirs. Immense plaster-lined reservoirs. The temple reservoir held millions of gallons, and even individual households had their own cisterns underground, called choltons, carved right into the limestone. This was a society that understood its climate intimately. Every element of their architecture served a dual purpose. The beauty was functional. This system, this intricate system, it allowed Tikal to support a vast population, a complex society of artisans, astronomers, rulers. For centuries it worked, the city thrived, but their pact with the environment, it was precise, calibrated for a certain range, a certain variability. Then research from scholars like Dr. Lisa Lucero points to a change, a series of prolonged droughts, severe ones, starting around the 9th century. Decades where the rains just didn't come, the reservoirs dried up, the canals sat empty. That carefully balanced machine, the hydrological machine, it began to fail. This was probably made worse by the city's own growth. Deforestation for agriculture and plaster, it may have altered local rainfall, created a feedback loop of aridity. The very ingenuity that let them flourish became their vulnerability. When the climate shifted beyond the boundaries of their design, the foundation of their society began to crack. Tikal's stone witnesses a truth. You can master your environment, but you have to prepare for the day it masters you. That theme of precarious balance, it finds another expression. In a place where engineers didn't just manage water, They convinced a mountain to drink it for them. Machu Picchu holds onto that ridge. It feels impossible, a city just hanging there between the sky and the jungle. But the Inca didn't see an obstacle. They saw the right conditions, a humid, subtropical mountain climate, rains that could wash anything away, so they didn't fight the water. They invited it in, they planned its every move. This 15th century estate for the Emperor Pachacuti was really a feat of water engineering. The real city is underneath. Hydraulic engineer Kenneth Wright says over 60% of the work here went into the foundation, not the walls. What's below, they dug deep, then filled those spaces with layers of crushed stone and gravel. That created a giant sponge, a foundation built to drain instantly. When the heavy rains hit the mountaintop, the water would sink through those layers. It would disperse, not pool, not start a landslide. Every stone was placed with that in mind. The terraces, the staircases, the plazas, all of them were subtly sloped. Channels cut right into the steps carried overflow away, turning destruction into a managed flow. Their water supply was precise calculation. They captured a spring more than a mile away. Then built a stone conduit, a hidden channel. Its slope was so carefully measured it delivered a steady stream by gravity alone. That channel fed a sequence of 16 fountains. Ceremonial fountains, each one a private blessing for the nobility, connected in a chain. The overflow from one fed the next, a graceful cascade. Even in the worst storms, fresh water flowed through the city. The agricultural terraces show the same foresight. They weren't just dirt on a hillside. They were layered structures, at the bottom large stones for drainage. Then gravel, then sand, then rich topsoil, that sand which let excess water percolate down. It kept the roots from rotting, and the stone base stopped the whole terrace from washing away in a downpour. They engineered stable pockets, microclimates of fertility on a steep slope. The Inca had a conversational knowledge of their environment. They read the geology. Predicted the water, they built a city that danced with the mountain's rhythms, and for centuries it's endured, a testament to that partnership. But it makes you wonder. What happens when the climate's music changes, when the rain's intensity shifts, when the springs change their patterns, beyond what that ancient design accounted for? Machu Picchu is a lesson in resilience through harmony, a lesson that would face its ultimate test somewhere else, in a place where harmony seems like a fantasy. Our next city wasn't built on a mountain. It was built inside a landscape so hostile, its very existence feels like a defiance of nature itself. Gaochang was a mirage. But it didn't fade. It was in the Turpan Depression, a place of extreme heat, and yet the city became lush. Its secret was a conversation with the mountains. The Tian Shan Range, with its snow and ice, held the water the desert didn't have. The engineers there, and the people before them, performed a kind of geological magic. They built the Carrez, a hidden river under the sand. This wasn't a simple ditch. It was a subterranean architecture, a work of precision. They started with a mother well. They dug down until they hit the water table, fed by mountain snowmelt miles away. From that deep point they carved a tunnel, a gently sloping channel heading downhill toward the city. The slope was everything, too steep, and the water would rush and erode the walls, too flat, and it wouldn't flow. They calculated it by hand, by eye, by generations of knowledge. Every 100 feet or so, they dug a vertical shaft up to the surface, for air, for removing earth, and for maintenance. Teams would descend to clear silt and repair collapses. A never-ending duty. The genius was in the physics. By keeping the water underground in those cool tunnels, they defeated the desert sun. Evaporation was nearly zero. That mountain water traveled for miles unseen until it emerged at the oasis, a sudden gift of cool water in the desert. This network made the impossible real. Vineyards flourished, orchards of melons grew. Gaochang became a famous Silk Road stop, a hub where cultures met, sustained by this hidden vein. The city was built to complement the system. Thick mud brick walls acted as thermal mass, soaking up daytime heat and releasing it at night. Narrow, winding streets created deep shade, a labyrinth for respite. Every part was engineered for a harsh climate, for aridity, wind, and brutal temperature shifts. Their civilization was a pact with that underground river. But a pact can be broken. The Kores demanded constant, coordinated care, a societal project, a web of shared responsibility. Historians point to periods of conflict, of social disruption, when that maintenance faltered. Tunnels could silt up, mother wells could shift, and without the collective will to keep digging, to keep clearing, the hidden river would choke, the vineyards would wither. The miracle would end. Gaochang's abandonment whispers a lesson. The most brilliant environmental engineering is only as strong as the social fabric that maintains it. When either unravels, the city's reason for being vanishes. This symbiosis with a scarce resource, this life pulled from nothing, finds a parallel not in a desert river, but in something even more ephemeral. Our next city learned to drink the wind itself. The wind brought them water. On those volcanic slopes in the Canary Islands, the Guanches people, they lived with this stark scarcity. No permanent rivers, but they built a society that lasted centuries. Their secret was a partnership with this fleeting climate, a persistent sea of clouds, this blanket of fog. It would roll in from the ocean and cling to the mid-altitude slopes. They didn't just live there, they engineered for it. Their settlements, like the cave complexes at Akusa, they weren't random. They were placed with intention, right in the path of that moist, horizontal precipitation. The architecture itself became a fog catcher. They used the porous volcanic rock of their semi-subterranean dwellings. These caves and stone structures, they had a natural genius. The walls would cool the moist air drifting through. The fog would condense on the surface, beading into droplets. They could channel that into carved cisterns. Researchers, anthropologists studying the sites, they believe the Guanches may have even used certain types of local vegetation as living nets to trap more moisture from the air. Every element was an adaptation. They cultivated a hardy, drought-resistant barley in terraced fields, and those terraces did double duty. They captured rare rainfall. But more importantly, they captured the fog drip, the constant, gentle condensation from the clouds above that would water the crops. This relationship went beyond practicality. It shaped their worldview. Their sacred gathering circles, the Tagora, they're often found in locations with the highest incidence of fog, places where the clouds would swirl and settle. That suggests the water source was woven into their rituals, their social structure, their understanding of the world, their survival, their culture. It was built on a daily conversation with the sky. A conversation with a specific rhythm, a reliable pattern. Their entire existence was a specialized pact with that atmospheric phenomenon, which makes their story resonate today. Because that pattern is shifting, modern climate change is altering the reliability of those moist trade winds, the consistency of that life-giving fog bank. The Guanches mastered a world defined by a delicate, invisible resource. Their civilization was a testament to listening closely to a climate's whisper. But when the whisper changes or fades, what remains? That extreme specialization, that deep intertwining with a single element. It leads us to consider a different kind of atmospheric engineer. A city that didn't just harvest the wind for water, but harnessed its very power to shape an urban dream. The logic of a city can be written in the air. Along the Persian Gulf for centuries, urban life was shaped by one force, the wind. Ancient ports like Kalat al-Bahrain and Suraf, they weren't just trade hubs. They were machines for living, built for a specific climate, intense heat, stifling humidity. Their survival depended on a constant partner, the northerly Shamal wind. Archaeologist Robert Carter studies these places. He sees a city as a single, breathing organism. The entire layout was a response. Streets were narrow, winding canyons. They weren't for carts or processions. They were wind channels designed to funnel sea breezes deep into the city to sweep away heat. Houses turned inward, built around central courtyards. That was a thermal strategy. The courtyard would heat up, air would rise. That rising air would pull cooler air in from the shaded alleys through the home's rooms. A constant, gentle draft, a passive air conditioning system built from geometry, but the iconic invention was the badger, the wind catcher, a tower above the roof line with openings facing the wind. Its internal baffles would capture air, funnel it down a shaft into the living quarters. Often that shaft vented over a pool of water or a moist clay pot. The incoming air would pick up moisture, cooling through evaporation before it reached people inside. Elegant, silent, powered by the climate it was designed for. The materials were part of the pact: coral stone, gypsum plaster, porous, breathable, excellent insulators. They resisted heat transfer, keeping interiors cool against the blazing exterior. The dense urban fabric, shared walls, shaded pathways, it created a communal microclimate, a collective defense against the sun. This architectural language of thermal regulation, it wasn't a luxury. It was the foundation. It allowed dense populations, sophisticated markets, the flourishing of places like Suraf during the Islamic Golden Age, a thriving urban culture made possible by a deep understanding of airflow. Which leads to a question: what happens when that ancient pact is broken? When modern construction brings concrete and glass, materials that trap and radiate heat, abandoning passive cooling? Or when broader climate shifts alter the reliability, the direction of the very winds these cities were built to catch? The genius of these cities was integration with a stable atmospheric pattern. Their logic collapses if the wind changes its mind. This mastery of a harsh environment through design, it finds a parallel, a stark, frozen parallel. From the world's hottest coasts to one of its coldest frontiers, to a city engineered not for wind but for a foundation of eternal ice. The ground was their ally. A foundation of eternal ice. In the Siberian Arctic there was a trading post, Mangazeya, from the 16th century. It rose right out of the permafrost. This city was built on a kind of paradox. It needed the ground to stay frozen forever. A wooden fortress, a bustling town, a hub for the fur trade, what they called gold boiling. Every architectural choice was a calculation, a matter of heat. To build there was to understand a brutal rule. Heat was the enemy. You transfer warmth into the ground and the earth turns to slurry. It goes soft beneath your feet, so they built on thick pads of gravel or on wooden pilings driven deep into the frozen earth. These layers were insulation, a buffer between the warmth of human life and the thermal balance below. Their cellars weren't just storage, they were natural freezers carved into the permafrost. Preserving food, preserving trade goods through the endless winter. The town's layout read the landscape. Buildings were clustered tightly, they shared walls. Conserving every bit of warmth, streets were planned around the winds to manage the snowdrifts, the crushing drifts that could bury a settlement alive. The log cabins were works of flexible genius, specialized corner notches. They let the structures expand and contract with the violent temperature swings. From -50 in winter to a brief, thawing summer, life there was a direct negotiation, a negotiation with the cold. Winter festivals celebrated the darkness. The economy ran on the luxuries of frost, the thick pelts of Arctic fox and sable. Their entire world, their wealth, was predicated on that stable, frozen ground. But that was the flaw. Their very success began to undermine the foundation. Each fire in a hearth, each gathering of people and animals in those packed buildings. It all released heat, slowly. That heat seeped downward, Historians at the site see the evidence of this thaw. The permafrost, once solid as rock, began to soften. The pilings lost their grip, walls started to tilt, floors buckled as the ground turned unstable. The city, engineered for a frozen world, began to sink. Into the mire it had created, Mangazeya's abandonment is an early lesson, a lesson in disruption. Human activity, even just the basic need for warmth, altered the thermal equilibrium. The equilibrium that made the city possible. It's a problem that echoes today. As modern Arctic communities face similar threats, their fate is a reminder. Engineering a city for a climate is one thing, but engineering it to withstand the side effects of its own existence, that's another challenge. This delicate dance with a foundational element. Whether it's frozen ground or flowing water, it defines so many of these stories, and it leads to a city that faced the opposite challenge, a civilization that didn't fear the thaw. It depended entirely on the flood. The world they built came from the flood. Cahokia, those great earthen mounds, they rise from the Mississippi floodplain in Illinois. It was a creation, a city engineered for a rhythm, the regular, nourishing overflows of the river. Around 1050, this was the largest city north of Mexico. Its architects worked with earth. They moved millions of cubic feet of soil, basket by basket, shaping a landscape for power and survival. At its center was Monk's Mound, a platform larger at its base than the Great Pyramid. It was a statement, control over the land and the water that defined it. Timothy Porketat calls it a theater of power. And the central drama was managing the life-giving flood. The city's location was deliberate, a fertile peninsula cradled by rivers. The annual floods left new soil. Perfect for the crops that fueled it, maize, squash, beans, but floods are chaotic, destructive. So the engineers sculpted the terrain. They built over 120 mounds. These raised platforms held buildings, homes for the elite, and they were refuge islands during high water, a city that could rise above the flood. Between the mounds, they carved out sunken plazas. These open areas were for gatherings, but also part of a water system, linked by borrow pits and canals. These channels managed water for ceremony, for transport, maybe for raising fish. An early aquaculture, the whole urban plan was a machine for living with the river. It turned the floodplain's threat into its advantage. This environment supported tens of thousands. Connected by trade routes across the continent, for a time the pact held, the city thrived, but a civilization built on a climatic pattern is vulnerable to change. Cahokia's decline around the 13th century coincides with climatic shifts. Sediment cores and tree rings point to the Little Ice Age. It may have altered the flood regime. The nourishing floods became less predictable or more severe. A sequence of major floods could wash away the fields. A prolonged drought would leave canals empty, crops parched. Either shift struck at the foundation of their authority. A society whose power was rooted in controlling water would face a crisis if that control slipped. The mounds still stand, a testament to moving earth to secure a place in a fluid world, and a reminder that monumental engineering is a conversation with a climate that doesn't promise to stay the same. This practice of reshaping land finds an inverted echo in the next city, where they didn't build mounds up but carved their entire world down into the earth. The lake wasn't a frontier for them, it was their foundation. Tenochtitlan, this city, it rose out of Lake Texcoco. They built it there on purpose, an engineered city for a world made of water. Founded in 1325, it was a staggering feat of hydro-engineering. They didn't just settle a swamp, they built new land. They used a technique perfected over generations. Chinampas, these weren't simple rafts. Workers would stake out rectangular plots in the shallow lake bed, weave these giant wicker frames, then fill them. Layers of mud, sediment, decaying vegetation, all dredged up from the lake bottom. The result was a floating island, incredibly fertile. anchored by willow trees, their roots knitting down into the lake floor. These chinampas, they were the city's agricultural heart. Multiple harvests every year, feeding a vast population. The canals between them, those were transport routes. Irrigation channels, part of a whole complex water management system. It defined everything. The city's layout was an aquatic grid. 3 great causeways connected the island to the mainland. Each one had wooden bridges they could remove for defense. Aqueducts brought in fresh spring water from the mainland, but the masterstroke was a massive dike. Conceived by the engineer king Nezahualcoyotl, Lake Texcoco was saline, but western springs fed it with fresh water. This dike separated the waters. It created a controlled basin of fresh water around Tenochtitlan for drinking, for agriculture, while it held back the brackish eastern lake, a monumental act of environmental engineering. Maintaining that precise aquatic balance the city needed to exist. When Spanish soldiers first saw it in 1519, they were stunned. Bernal Diaz del Castillo wrote it seemed like an enchanted vision. Towers and temples rising from the water, canoes moving like veins through canals wider than streets. This was a civilization in perfect sync with its lake world. The conquest shattered that symbiosis. The Spanish vision was terrestrial. They saw floods as a problem to eliminate, not a rhythm to manage. They started draining the lakes, filling in the canals, demolishing the dikes. The aim was flood control, to create dry land for European-style construction. In doing that, they didn't just conquer a people. They dismantled an entire climate adaptation strategy, a 1,000-year conversation with the lake. The chinampas dried up. The careful balance of salinity was lost. The very foundation of the city's existence was methodically erased. Today, Mexico City sits on that drained lakebed. It's sinking, pumping the remaining aquifer dry. A monument to a different relationship with nature, an oppositional one. Tenochtitlan's story is a pinnacle of aquatic urbanism, a testament to building with an environment, not against it. Its loss forces a difficult reflection. What wisdom vanishes when you replace one world's logic with another's? That mastery of a specific, watery climate. It stands in utter contrast to the next city's achievement, a city that created comfort and community not by managing water, but by designing a fortress of shade and stillness. Right in the heart of a scorching desert, their world wasn't on the surface, it was underneath. In Anatolia, the land is stone, cones, pillars, Cappadocia. And below that, something else, Derinkuyu, a city carved down, a maze going more than 200 feet into soft volcanic rock. This wasn't a cave, it was a refuge. Climate-controlled, built for a continent, for scorching summers, freezing winters, for armies moving across the plains. The people there, over centuries, maybe starting in the 7th or 8th century BCE, they chose something radical. They went down. The soft volcanic tuff was the material, carvable, stable. They made a vertical fortress, a masterpiece of engineering underground. The design solved every problem of living sealed away from the sun. Ventilation came first. Dozens of slender shafts over 100 feet deep went from the lowest levels up to the surface. These weren't just air holes. It was a system. The temperature difference between the cool chambers below and the warmer air above created a convection current, a constant breath for the city. Fresh air drawn down one set of shafts, stale air pushed out another. It was a lung made of stone. Water came from the same deep planning. They tapped an aquifer, carving huge, barrel-shaped wells. A secure supply, isolated from surface contamination or siege. Defense was absolute. The narrow, sloping passages between levels could be sealed instantly. Massive, circular stone doors wheeled into place from inside. One person could block a corridor. Those doors had a small, central hole, a peephole and a port for a spear. Life down there was communal. Archaeologists have mapped at least 8 sprawling levels. Stables for livestock were up top. Further down, living quarters, storage rooms with amphorae of grain and oil. They carved churches with vaulted ceilings, wine presses, communal kitchens, ceilings blackened by centuries of hearth smoke, the soot-stained rock telling of shared meals in the deep earth. This was a self-contained system. It could shelter thousands for months, but beyond safety from conflict, Derinkuyu offered a deep climatic comfort. The geothermal mass of the earth gave perfect insulation. The temperature stayed a constant 55 degrees Fahrenheit all year, a sanctuary from the blistering Anatolian sun, a haven from the bitter winter winds above. Their architecture wasn't just about hiding, it was about finding a stable center in a world of surface extremes. The rock itself became a climate battery, storing one perfect season deep inside. Derinkuyu asks a haunting question. What does it say about a society when its most impressive civic project is a place to disappear? It speaks to seeing the surface world as fundamentally unstable. Not just politically, but climatically. The world above was hardship, danger, exhausting seasonal swings. Their greatest engineering triumph was an escape from all of it. A bid for resilience carved in stone. Today, architects look at these passive geothermal principles for modern sustainable design, using the Earth's constant temperature to heat and cool buildings above. Derinkuyu is an ancient, radical blueprint for that idea, a testament to escaping climate extremes not by conquering them, but by retreating into the planet's own steady embrace. This deep, inward turn for stability finds its absolute opposite in the next city's strategy. They didn't go down, they built up into the clouds looking for a different kind of refuge. Their escape was carved deep into the earth, but another civilization, they found their sanctuary in the sky. The Chachapoya people, they built their world where the clouds settle on the eastern slopes of the Peruvian Andes. In that perpetual mist, they were the warriors of the clouds. Their cities, like the fortress of Kuelap, they seemed to grow right from the fog. They built these places over centuries, from about 900 to 1400 CE. These were citadels engineered for a very specific climate, a cool, moist, eternally green cloud forest. The air there is always damp, a fine drizzle, a clinging mist. That's the normal state. So their architecture became a dialogue with moisture. They built with limestone, which was abundant, but their genius was in the form. Massive perimeter walls, some 60 feet high, encircling the city. Not just for defense, but as a first barrier against the weather. Inside, hundreds of circular stone houses with conical thatched roofs. That shape was practical. The steep pitch let rain and condensation sheet off quickly. It prevented rot. It stopped the slow seep of water that would undermine a flat roof. The walls often had these intricate zigzag and rhomboid friezes. And these weren't just decoration. The deeply carved patterns, they may have helped channel runoff away from the structures. Every line had a purpose in managing the wet. The location was a climatic choice, too. Perched on high ridges, the cities caught the breezes sweeping through the cloud layer. That constant air movement helped ventilate the homes. It dried the interiors, it fought the mold the humidity encouraged. Their terraced fields clung to the steep mountainsides, but this agriculture wasn't for erratic seasonal rains. It was built for reliability. The ever-present mist and drizzle, they provided a constant, gentle irrigation. They grew crops adapted to that cool, damp niche. Their entire society was calibrated to that stable, misty microclimate. Kuelap's entrance is a masterpiece of this design, a narrow, ascending ramp funneled between the massive walls. It controlled access, but in that fog, it also controlled sightlines. It controlled movement in the damp. Approaching armies would be channeled, exposed. For the residents, it was a grand processional into their aerial kingdom. Then, in the late 15th century, the Inca Empire arrived. The conquest was a clash of worlds. The Inca, masters of the high, dry Andes, they absorbed the Chachapoya lands. That brought new social structures, new demands, but the true disruption to the balance came later. With the Spanish in the 16th century came pathogens from across the ocean, illnesses like smallpox. The isolated cloud forest populations had no defense. The loss of life was catastrophic. It shattered the social fabric. It broke the knowledge systems. It destroyed the labor force that maintained those stone cities. The terraces fell into disrepair. The thatch roofs decayed. Without the community to sustain it, the delicate pact between the city and its climate unraveled. The mist still rolls through the empty doorways of Kuelap. The stone friezes still channel phantom rain. The abandonment there, it's a layered tragedy. It shows that climate adaptation isn't just clever engineering. It's a cultural project. It needs a living society to maintain the conversation with the environment. When that society is fractured, the most perfectly adapted city becomes a relic. It becomes a mystery, shrouded in the very clouds it was built to harness. That link between culture, survival, and a specific place, it finds its most extreme test in our next location, a city that didn't just adapt to a harsh climate. It was founded because of a city built where the ground itself is made of salt. Salt was their currency, their walls, their reason for being. In the Tena Desert in Niger, there's this place called Djado. A ghostly caisse on a plateau, a fortified settlement. It was engineered for a world of brutal aridity, and its peak in the first millennium, the world was only slightly less harsh than it is now. Its existence was a paradox, a thriving trade hub built in a place that seemed to reject life. The genius of Djado was in accepting that scarcity and turning it into power. The city was built from the very thing it traded, salt-rich mud and stone. These materials weren't just convenient, they were a statement. The architecture was a masterclass in passive cooling. Thick, massive walls acted as thermal batteries, soaking up the daytime heat, then slowly releasing it during the cold desert night. That kept the interior spaces from the worst extremes. Windows were small, mere slits, not for views but for defense against the sun and the blowing sand. The buildings were stacked together, multi-story structures interconnected, creating a shaded labyrinth of narrow alleys and sheltered courtyards. The entire city was a machine for creating shade, a communal refuge from the open sky. But stone and shade alone can't sustain a city. The true lifeline was water, and it was desperately scarce. Survival depended on ancient, deep wells. Tapping fossil aquifers, water that had fallen as rain millennia before, the management of those wells was a sacred duty, a matter of communal survival. Every drop was measured, allocated, protected. This careful balance allowed a permanent settlement to exist, but the city's purpose wasn't just to survive. It was to control. Djado sat astride a vital trans-Saharan trade route. Its position gave it command over the nearby salt pans. In that desert economy, salt was white gold. Essential for preserving food, for nutrition, for trade with the forest regions to the south. Camel caravans would arrive, thousands of animals long, laden with goods. They would depart carrying blocks of precious salt. Djado was the fortress that guarded this exchange, the economic engine that justified such a monumental effort in such an unforgiving place. Its labyrinthine layout served a dual purpose. It was a defensive maze against raiders and a climatic maze against the sun. Every turn was calculated. Every wall placed to cast the longest shadow. The city was a node, a critical point in a vast, fragile network that stretched across a continent. Its wealth, its culture, its very identity flowed from that connection. So when the network frayed, the city's reason to exist evaporated. Shifts in trade routes, maybe from political instability elsewhere, a gradual, deepening aridification that made the caravan journeys even more perilous. The slow exhaustion of those ancient wells, any of these could unravel the pact. Djado's haunting abandonment speaks to a profound vulnerability. A civilization engineered as a node in a network is only as resilient as the network itself. When the lines of trade and communication snap, the node goes dark. No matter how perfectly adapted it is to its local climate, the ruins stand now in a silence even deeper than before. The climate has continued its slow desiccation. The trade routes have vanished into myth. What remains is a skeleton of salt and stone, a monument to an economy built on aridity, and a warning about the fragility of connections. This story of density and trade leads to a different kind of urban logic, not a fortress in the open desert, but a city where the architecture itself became a mountain. A place where they didn't just build houses, they built a single, continuous structure for an entire community. Their skyline was carved from earth. In the deep valley of Hadramaut, there's the city of Shibam. It rises like a fortress of clay, a dense cluster of tower houses, some 8 stories high, all built from sun-dried mud brick. This is a 16th century answer to a harsh world. A hot, arid desert climate with rare but violent flash floods. The whole design negotiates scarcity. The fertile soil of the wadi floor was too precious for streets. So they built up. You get this vertical urban canyon. These tightly packed towers cast deep shadows over the narrow alleys below. The lower levels stay cool, even in the blistering sun. That self-shading architecture was a masterstroke of passive cooling, a community creating its own microclimate through density and form. But the mud brick itself is the true genius. Those thick walls are phenomenal insulators. They soak up the sun's heat all day, stopping it from getting inside. Then, during the cool desert night, they slowly release that stored warmth. That thermal lag creates a stable temperature inside. A refuge from the extreme swings outside. The verticality also served defense, a necessity in a land of tribal raids. A compact, towering city was easier to protect, and for the other great threat, the occasional devastating flood, they built a massive protective wall around the entire city base. A sacrificial barrier to divert the torrents. Life in these towers was communal, layered. The ground floors were for animals and storage. Living quarters ascended upward. The highest floors and flat rooftops were for the cool evening breezes, for social gatherings. The entire structure was a social and climatic machine. It let a large community exist securely in an environment that seemed to forbid it. Yet this architectural marvel comes with a condition. It is ephemeral. Mud brick erodes, it melts under heavy rain. The survival of Shibam depends on constant renewal, a ritual of maintenance. Every year, after the seasonal rains, residents must replaster their walls with a fresh layer of mud and straw. This isn't just repair, it's an ongoing cultural dialogue, a conversation between the community and the demanding climate that shaped it. Each new layer of mud is a reaffirmation of the ancient pact. A statement that they choose to remain, to preserve this way of life. That's the haunting question Shibam poses now. As climate patterns shift, as rainfall becomes more erratic, this delicate cycle of maintenance is disrupted. The knowledge and the collective will required for this endless renewal, can it endure? Shibam stands as a testament to a core idea. That urban density isn't just a modern imposition. It can be one of humanity's oldest forms of environmental adaptation. A city that turned its greatest constraint, the need to conserve fertile land, into its most iconic feature. A skyline of earth reaching for the sky to find shade below. This logic of compact, communal living for survival finds a radical counterpoint in the next city's strategy, which chose not to cluster tightly but to spread itself wide across the landscape in a vast, intricate net designed to catch a single, precious resource. The city was shaped by the monsoon. In northwest Cambodia, the Khmer Empire built more than temples. They engineered an entire landscape for a climate of 2 seasons. A long, drenching monsoon, then a punishing dry period. Angkor's genius was capturing that deluge and parceling it out precisely across the year. This was a metropolitan-scale hydraulic machine. Woven into the city's fabric, at its heart were the barrays, immense rectangular reservoirs. The West Barray is a perfect geometric lake, over 5 miles long, 1.5 miles wide. An artificial inland sea hand-excavated. Its banks are precise. Its purpose was total control. During the monsoon, canals funneled floodwaters into these basins, capturing the abundance. Then, through the dry season, a reverse network of channels released that stored water, gravity-fed, to irrigate vast rice paddies, to stabilize the water table so the ground wouldn't sink or crack, to fill the moats of temples like Angkor Wat, turning them into mirrors of the cosmos. The temples themselves were microcosms of this system. Their carvings show celestial beings, mythical oceans, but the real cosmology was in the hydrology. The temple layout, the moats, the causeways, they mirrored a vision of a universe in balance, where water was the sacred medium of order. For centuries, this worked on a staggering scale. LiDAR technology, seeing through the jungle canopy, revealed the true extent. Dr. Damian Evans and his team mapped a low-density urban complex, nearly 400 square miles. Canals linked neighborhoods, temples, and fields into a single organism, a dispersed city held together by water. This engineered landscape supported a population that may have approached 1 million in the 12th century. One of the largest cities the pre-industrial world had ever seen. Its survival was planning on a civilizational scale, but that scale created a vulnerability. The system demanded constant, expert maintenance. Canals needed dredging, spillways and overflow channels designed to prevent catastrophic flooding had to be kept clear. The entire network was a delicate equilibrium. So what happens when that equilibrium is stressed? Paleoclimatologists studying tree rings found periods of severe drought in the 14th and 15th centuries. Decades where the monsoons failed, the giant barrays would have lain empty, the rice paddies would have cracked. A society built on mastering water would face a crisis of authority when the water vanished. This may have been compounded by the city's own success. The sprawling population likely led to deforestation, which can alter local rainfall, creating a feedback loop of aridity. The intricate system, tuned to a specific climate rhythm, began to fall out of sync. Angkor's shift from a political capital wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a slow unraveling, a renegotiation of a pact that could no longer be sustained. The legacy is one of breathtaking ambition. It shows how far a society will go to reshape its environment for survival and splendor, but it also whispers a warning about fragility. Even the grandest designs, when your city is a machine built for a specific climate, a shift in that climate can stop the machine. This monumental act of moving water across a plain leads to a different kind of intervention, where engineers moved not water, but the very earth beneath their feet, to create a sheltered world in a landscape of relentless wind. Great Zimbabwe rose from the Savannah hills, built from granite slabs fitted without mortar. It was a capital for centuries, engineered for seasonal rains and dry winds. The whole layout spoke to the climate. The city was on 2 levels. The hill complex sat on a granite dome which gave natural drainage. The slopes and the terracing channeled rainwater away, so during the wet season, the living areas wouldn't flood. Down in the valley, the great enclosure had these massive, curved walls. They were over 30 feet high in places, and they weren't just for prestige. They broke the force of the dry winds coming across the plateau. Inside the walls, it would have been quieter, cooler, a microclimate protected. The architecture managed water simply. The rooftops, probably thatched, caught rainfall. They channeled it into storage pits lined with a clay mixture called dhaka. That was the reserve for the long dry season. The separation between the hilltop and the valley wasn't just about status, it was environmental zoning. The elite areas had the best drainage, the cooling breezes, the security of height. Commoner homesteads were out in the valleys, near arable land and water sources. Their lives were tied to the agricultural rhythms, the savannah. Their economy came from that climate. Cattle were wealth, grazing on the seasonal grasses. Gold from inland mines connected them to an Indian Ocean trade network. They grew drought-resistant crops, sorghum and millet. The whole civilization was calibrated to the reliable shift between wet and dry. Then the city declined around the 15th century. The pact was under strain. There's evidence of overgrazing around the site that would have stripped the land, increased erosion, reduced how well the land held water. This environmental pressure might have met broader climatic shifts, maybe a series of drier cycles. Those cycles would have stressed the agricultural and pastoral systems the city was built on. The stone walls, so good at managing seasonal water and wind, couldn't fix a deeper ecological imbalance. So the legacy is one of stone and social order, a hierarchy built in harmony with an environmental rhythm. The empty enclosures ask a question: can the architecture of power withstand the erosion of its natural foundation? Their homes were built on the water. In places across the Pacific, like the islands in Fiji's Lau group, these Polynesian communities created stilt villages. They rose over calm lagoons and coral reefs. This was architecture for a specific climate, a maritime world with lots of seafood, not much flat land, and the constant possibility of storms. They didn't fight the sea. They used it as a foundation. The structures were made from local wood and thatch, materials that could bend with the waves, not just stand rigid against them. That flexibility was the point. It was resilience through movement. The elevated floors gave direct access to fishing grounds. You could drop a line right from your home. But it was more than just convenient. The space underneath let the sea breezes flow through, a natural cooling system. Living over the water also meant separation from pests on land. And it gave a clear view for seeing weather or boats approach. This wasn't random. It was a sophisticated adaptation. It came from generations of deep knowledge. To build here meant understanding the tides, the seasonal storm patterns, the health of the coral reef, which protected the village from the open ocean. The safety of everyone depended on that reef being alive. This way of life had a fluid boundary. There was no sharp line between the settlement and its source. The village was part of the marine ecosystem. The sea was the backyard, the pantry, the climate control. Daily life was a constant conversation with the currents and the seasons. This form of living, mostly gone now, shows a different idea of resilience. It wasn't about monumental, permanent construction. It was lightweight and adaptive. It prioritized mobility and deep knowledge over a huge investment in material. The stilt village was a point in a wider network. Gardens on land, fishing grounds at sea. It could be repaired or modified or even moved following the rhythms of the environment. Its strength was in being integrated, not isolated. This model suggests an alternative to stone citadels and vast reservoirs. It asks us to think of resilience not as a fortress against nature, but as a kind of dance with it, a dance that requires listening to the tides, to the reef. This philosophy of lightweight adaptation is the opposite of another impulse. Our next city is perhaps the most monumental act of water storage ever attempted by an ancient society. Constantinople in the 6th century, it was an ancient capital, but the world around it was changing. The climate was becoming less predictable, and the aqueducts, these great channels bringing water from far-off forests, they were the city's lifeline. But they were also a point of weakness. An enemy could cut them. A long drought could leave them almost dry. Justinian I saw this. His answer wasn't to build more aqueducts. It was to build a battery, a water battery, the Basilica Cistern, a submerged palace, 336 marble columns holding up a cavernous ceiling in the dark. This wasn't a temple, it was a reservoir, defensive foresight carved right into the bedrock, a climate adaptation on a staggering scale. It could hold millions of gallons. Water was channeled in from the aqueducts when it was plentiful. Rainwater was collected from across the city. It created a strategic reserve completely enclosed. A buffer against siege, against scarcity. For months, even if the aqueducts were cut or the rains failed, this hidden sea could sustain the population. That's a shift in philosophy, from relying on a constant, vulnerable flow to the security of massive storage. The engineering was psychological as much as it was practical. It gave the city a deep resilience, a confidence that it could endure. This infrastructure was the hidden foundation of Byzantine power. While armies pressed at the Theodosian walls, life inside went on. Fountains flowed, baths stayed open. The psychological blow of cutting the water supply, a classic siege tactic. It was neutralized. The cisterns turned a climatic uncertainty, a political uncertainty, into a managed risk. They let Constantinople weather crises that would have broken other cities. To remain a powerhouse for centuries, its survival underpinned by this dark, still water. The scale of the investment, it speaks volumes. It shows a society that had moved beyond just mastering its environment. It was now insulating itself from that environment's failures. Water was no longer just a resource to be managed. It was the key to urban survival in a changing world. The shift from aqueduct to cistern, it's a profound adaptation. It's the recognition that abundance can't be assumed. That resilience lies not in the constant stream, but in the capacity to save for a harsher season. That foresight, that preparation for scarcity, it finds an echo in another kind of adaptation, not to the threat of drought, but to the unyielding grasp of cold. Our final cities, they didn't store water against a changing climate. They stored warmth, they stored community and life against an eternal winter. The desert keeps its cold. In Persia, on those high plateaus, you had cities like Yazd and Kashan. They were built for a rhythm of extremes, blazing days, then frigid nights, and the idea there, it wasn't just about catching a breeze. It was about capturing winter. They built these ice houses called yakchuls, conical structures made of mud brick, rising right out of the sand. Some of them are over 2,000 years old. And these weren't just cellars, they were like thermodynamic machines, built to stand against the desert sun for months. The process started in winter. Workers would channel water into shallow basins on the coldest nights, letting it freeze into sheets of ice, or they'd bring ice down from the mountain peaks. That precious resource was then taken down into the heart of the yakchul. The design was all passive physics. The thick, domed walls were made with a special mortar, saruj. A mix of clay and sand, ash, egg whites. It created a superb insulator, and the structure had a deep underground pit, sometimes 50 feet down, that placed the ice deep within the cool mass of the earth. A nearby kanat, that underground water channel, would help. Its constant flow cooled the surrounding soil, but the real magic was the shape. The tall, conical dome had vents at the very top. So hot air inside would rise and escape, and the thick walls stopped external heat from radiating in. The system used evaporative cooling, too. Any meltwater would seep down through gravel floors, evaporating and pulling more heat from the chamber as it went. A self-reinforcing cycle of cold. The result was ice year-round in the middle of a desert summer. And this wasn't a frivolous thing. It was a cornerstone for public health, for culinary culture. The ice preserved food, slowed spoilage. It chilled medicines. It allowed for chilled desserts like falude, a sorbet. It could even cool the rooms of the wealthy, a precursor to air conditioning. The yakchul was a communal project. Its building and upkeep needed shared knowledge, coordinated labor. It reflected a society that planned across seasons, that saw a fleeting resource, the winter cold, as something to be harvested. Stored, rationed for the common good. Its place in the city, alongside wind catchers and shaded alleyways, shows a holistic vision. They weren't tackling heat with one tool. They built a layered ecosystem of climate control. This ancient technology asks a question of our modern world. In an age of energy-intensive cooling, what can we learn from a society that stored the climate itself? The Yachtl teaches that adaptation can be an act of foresight, of seeing time as a resource to be shaped. It turns scarcity into abundance through ingenuity. And patience, this final act of storing a season, brings us to the 20th city, the last one, a place that represents the ultimate ancient experiment in engineered survival. A city built for a world that wasn't just changing but actively disappearing. The ground was their shelter. On those sun-baked mesas, the ancestral Pueblones had this response to the high desert. A place of scorching days, bitter nights, and not many trees for fuel. Their solution was to go down, to build with the earth itself. The pit house and the kiva that came from it were about passive climate control. These were circular rooms dug several feet down into the soil or the rock. By putting living spaces below the surface, they used the Earth's thermal mass. The ground at a certain depth stays at a stable temperature all year, so in summer the pit house stayed cool, a refuge, and in winter it held the heat from a central hearth much better than any structure above ground. The design was a closed system, a central fire pit for heat and light, a ventilation shaft placed just right to bring in air and pull smoke out. Entry was usually a single hole in the roof with a ladder. That sealed the space, it minimized drafts, it conserved everything: body heat, firewood, effort. This architectural intelligence was part of a larger adaptation. To a marginal land, their settlements, like at Mesa Verde or Choco Canyon, show a deep reading of the environment. They built great houses aligned with solar and lunar cycles. They made systems to capture every drop of rare rainwater. They practiced seasonal migration, moving between highlands and lowlands. The pit house was the foundation of all that. A humble technology that turned the planet's own steady temperature into a survival strategy. You find this form all over the world, from the Arctic to the Australian outback. It's a universal insight: when the climate above is harsh, find stability in the ground below. But even this ancient wisdom had limits. The great centers like Choco Canyon were eventually left behind. Research points to a combination of challenges: a prolonged drought over generations in the 12th and 13th centuries that would have strained the water systems. Their very success may have led to local depletion over harvesting timber, game, land. The architectural adaptation was perfect for normal climate extremes. But it couldn't compensate for a fundamental, long-term shift in the rules. When the rains didn't return for decades, when the pinyon forests didn't regrow, the social foundations eroded. The people migrated, they carried the knowledge with them. The silent kivas, the empty pit houses, they close this journey through 20 cities. They return us to the essential act. The human act of shaping a shelter in direct conversation with a specific sky, a specific soil, a specific rhythm of sun and rain. Each city was an answer to an environmental question. From desert fog catchers to mountain water clocks, from subterranean refuges to floating gardens, they all represent a pact, a temporary, brilliant, fragile pact between a community's ambition and the world's conditions. Their ruins aren't just monuments, they're prototypes, case studies in resilience and vulnerability. They ask us, in our own time of climatic uncertainty, what new pacts we're forging, and what ancient wisdom we might need to remember. Each city solved a specific environmental problem. They're monuments to a kind of localized wisdom. Their builders understood their landscapes in a way we can barely grasp. They turned fog into water for crops. They turned flash floods into storage. They built foundations on permafrost. Their success was total, but it was conditional. It was a brilliant, temporary agreement with the world in a particular state. This is architecture of impermanence, a recognition that even our greatest structures exist inside a longer, more powerful conversation with the planet. These societies didn't design for every possible future. They engineered for the climate they knew, for the rhythms they'd watched for generations. The Corrèze tunnels at Gaochang were a masterpiece for catching mountain snowmelt in a dry basin. The Chinampa Gardens of Tenochtitlan were a perfect answer to life on a shallow lake. They were sustainable in a practical, immediate sense. They created balance for their time. But that balance was never static. Sustainability, these ruins suggest, isn't a destination you reach. It's a verb. It's the continuous act of listening, maintaining, adapting. The vulnerability often came not from an engineering flaw, but from a break in the social contract that upheld it. The Corrèze required communal digging crews. The raised fields of the Maya needed coordinated labor. The constant replastering of Shibam's mud towers was a shared ritual. When social cohesion frayed through conflict or disease or shifting priorities, the meticulous maintenance these systems required could stop. And once the maintenance stopped, the engineered balance began to unravel. There's another, subtler vulnerability here: over-specialization. Each city was a pinnacle of adaptation to a very narrow set of conditions. The Nabateans were geniuses of violent, sporadic desert floods. The Guanches were masters of a persistent cloud bank. But what happens when the desert floods stop coming for a generation? Or when the cloud bank lifts and doesn't return? Their entire society, from economy to spiritual beliefs, was built around that one climatic relationship. That deep specialization was their strength, and ultimately, in a changing world, their potential fragility. This forces a difficult question back on our own time. We look back and see ancient cities built for climates that no longer exist. But from a future perspective, what will they say of our cities? Our modern megacities are also engineered marvels. They're built on a foundational assumption of climatic stability, the predictable patterns of the last 10,000 years, the Holocene. Our concrete coastlines, our agricultural regions, our water networks, they all assume a certain range of temperature, a certain pattern of rain. Are we just the next chapter in this story? Are our own urban networks a new kind of climatic pact, one whose terms are being rewritten right now? The lesson from these cities isn't despair. It's clarity. They show that human ingenuity is most powerful when it's in dialogue with the environment, not in a monologue of control. Their legacy is a blueprint for a mindset: deep observation, adaptive maintenance, humility before a dynamic planet. The silent stones ask what we're building for and what we're willing to sustain. Looking back at those 20 cities, there's a clear thread. We've always engineered our world. We've shaped stone and earth and water, building habitats in a kind of dialogue with the environment. These ruins aren't tombstones, they're more like textbooks. If you're willing to read the weathered pages, they teach resilience, quiet innovation, a necessary humility. They show the climate was never just a static backdrop. It was always an active participant, a co-author in every story of rise and in every story of departure. The monsoon that filled Angkor's reservoirs, the permafrost that held Mangazeya firm, the fog that watered the Guanches fields. These weren't just resources, they were partners in a kind of pact. And when the terms of that pact shifted, the city's foundation was tested. Now, facing our own changes, these old stories speak with a new urgency. They aren't blueprints we can copy directly. We can't build wind catchers for skyscrapers. We can't carve cisterns beneath modern cities the same way, but they are a blueprint for a mindset. They urge us to design for flexibility, not rigidity. To build systems that can absorb shock, that can be adjusted, that leave room for the unexpected. They remind us to respect ecological limits, that every engineering triumph exists inside a wider, living system. And maybe most important, they ask us to remember the most enduring legacy might not be a monument meant to last forever. It might be an adaptation that allows for change itself. A design that knows when to hold firm and when to let go, when to store abundance and when to move on. Let these cities be a reminder to look beyond the immediate horizon. To engineer not just for today's climate, but with the wisdom to adapt to tomorrow's unknown skies. Their stones hold a conversation that began millennia ago. A conversation about survival, about home, about our place in a world that's always in flux. It's a conversation we're still having, and we would do well to listen to the echo.